Power Factor Show with Steve and Rick. Episode 17, IDPA cover, kneeling, and prone.
Gun Rights Radio Network has the best pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights podcast available on the net. The podcasts are absolutely free when subscribing using iTunes or Zune Marketplace. Or if you want, you can just listen from the website. Make sure you visit gunrightsradio.com to subscribe. Podcasting freedom, one episode at a time.
Hey, welcome back to Power Factor. I'm Steve.
And I'm Rick.
And today we're going to talk about IDPA use of cover, and also we're going to talk about kneeling and prone shooting.
So let's get to it. So we're going to talk about cover. One of the biggest difference, probably the biggest difference between IDPA competition and USPSA competition is in IDPA, if there's cover on the course of fire, it must be used. And in fact, of course, the cover is concealment. If you make the distinction between cover being something that actually blocks incoming fire, concealment being something that blocks the view of a potential threat, we call it cover for purposes of the match. Concealment. So pretend for the purposes of this discussion that this is actually like a cinder block wall or brick wall or something that'll stop bullets, and that we'll be using for cover. The cover rule in IDPA is that when you're shooting around a vertical surface like the edge of this wall, no part of your lower body may be exposed to the threat target that's being engaged. And no more than 50% of your upper body can be exposed to that threat. So if I were to use this as cover to engage a target that's directly downrange, I want to make sure that my foot is inside this vertical edge so that no part of my lower body shows. And then I don't want to lean out any more than 50%. The rule book also dictates that cover be used for reloading. And any position of cover that's sufficient for shooting is also sufficient for reloading. You do not have to disappear behind cover when doing a reload. So if I were engaging a target from this position and a reload was necessary, I could maintain this position while I perform the reload. If you're shooting through a port, such as this window cut in the wall, the same situation applies to the edge of this port as applies to the edge of the wall. So for instance, I cannot stand in the middle of this wall, this port in the wall, and shoot like this. I must pie, as it's called, the edge of this vertical surface. If there are targets downrange of this port, I cannot cross the port without first engaging from this near vertical wall. So it creates a situation where if you are engaging in tactical priority, which will normally be the case when you're shooting around cover, that means I'll generally refer to it as outside in. So if I'm shooting around this surface, I'll have to engage the target that's furthest to the right in the array that I'm engaging. If I'm shooting around this side of a vertical surface, that same outside in would mean shooting from left to right. And again, remember, you can be exposed to a target that's already been engaged, or possibly, depending on how the course of fire is laid out, a target that has yet to be engaged that you're not engaging. So from this position, if the target is directly where the camera is, I'm using a pretty good position of cover. My foot is about as far out as it could be without being beyond this line, and I can engage a target that's straight down range. Now, if I have to engage a target that's only about 45 degrees off of that, I'm going to have to reposition my body a little bit, because what you'll find is as you start transitioning across like this, you'll see my stance falls completely apart. You want to try to keep your head upright, keep the gun vertical, and if as you're transitioning you start doing this, or even worse, crowding the cover, and then you end up doing this, it really screws up your form and you're not going to shoot very well. Give yourself some room. Stand at least at arm's length back from the cover. That way you can pretty much use your standard shooting stance. You do have to kind of put your weight more on your strong side leg, because you don't want to get that foot hanging out. You'll find probably 99% of the time, if you arrive at a shooting position, you're engaging targets, and the safety officer is giving you cover calls, yelling, warning, cover, cover, it's going to be your foot that's hanging out. So be mindful of where that foot is relative to this vertical surface. It's not always easy because walls are typically of this kind of construction where the actual vertical line ends before it gets to the ground. Fault lines will not be present. There won't be any kind of an indicator on the ground of how far you can stick your foot out. So be aware of where that point is, in this case kind of an imaginary line of where that wall comes down to the ground, and make sure your foot is inside that line. Stay well back from the wall, and if necessary, alter your shooting position slightly as you transition across the array so that your shooting stance doesn't fall apart. Likewise, when you're shooting through a window, be mindful of this vertical edge. Don't cross the port before you've engaged any targets that are downrange. And yeah. Okay, now what we're doing is we've got the camera set up for the kind of what I would call the safety officer's viewpoint. The safety officer is going to be standing in a position from which he can determine whether you're using perfect cover or even imperfect but adequate cover. He wants ideally to be positioned so that your body and the edge of the cover and the target are all in a straight line, so he can just look down this line and see if you're properly using cover or not. Standing right here, I'm using good cover. My foot is inside the edge of the wall. My upper body isn't hanging out too far. Now, if I were to stand like this, clearly the safety officer's view shows that my foot is hanging out, and he should be warning me, cover, cover. He's not required to yell the warning. He can just ding me for leaving my foot out here. But if you approach the cover like this, before you fire a shot, a kindly safety officer should give you a warning. Cover, get your foot in to take that shot. Now to transition to the next target, from this position, I'm going to have to move my foot slightly to get to the second target, and then I'm going to have to move it again to get to the third target. It's possible to get into a single position that allows a transition, say, from T1 to T2, because they're fairly close together. You could probably get a position and just lean out a little bit more to get to the second one. But if you've got a wide transition between two targets, you're almost surely going to have to move your feet. And so you want to just make sure you arrive at the cover position for the first shot, and you'll have to make a slight transition for the second, and then another transition for the third. But again, don't crowd the cover, because you don't want to get the gun pulled in like this. You don't want to get it sideways. Give yourself plenty of room. The same is going to be the case if you have to reload. If you're right in here on the wall like this, and then you're going to have to do a reload, you've got to bring the gun in. It can get pretty tricky trying to maintain the 180, keep the gun down range, get your manipulations done. Just stay back. Give yourself some room.
Here's a tip from Rick.
Some competitive divisions in both IDPA and USPSA require that the gun be loaded to a specific capacity. In USPSA production in limited 10, that means at the start of the course of fire, that is when the timer goes off, no magazine can have more than 10 rounds in it. Most of the guns that are shot in production division have a magazine capacity. The physical capacity of the magazines themselves is greater than 10 rounds. So make sure that you don't load more than 10 in any magazine. Now a lot of shooters will put an 11th round in the first magazine that they intend to use on the course of fire, so that the load make ready just consists of inserting the mag, racking the slide, and then they're ready to go. And then when they holster, all of the mags on their person then have 10 rounds in them. That's also true in IDPA Enhanced Service Pistol and IDPA Stock Service Pistol, which also have 10-round capacity limits. A little bit different problem exists in Custom Defensive Pistol Division in IDPA, where the predominant gun you'll find is the single-stack 1911 style 45. Those guns, depending on the size of the gun, whether it's full size or compact, will have magazines of 6 rounds, 7 rounds, or 8 rounds capacity. All of the mags that you use on a course of fire must be loaded with the same number of rounds. So if you come to the match and all you have is 7 rounders, it's perfectly fine to load them all to 7. If you had, for instance, 1 8-rounder and 2 7-rounders, all 3 mags have to be loaded to 7 rounds. So all of them have to be the same. And of course, in custom defensive pistol, your limit is 8 rounds anyway. But you can't mix and match. You can't put 6 rounds in one mag, 7 in another. They all have to have the same number of rounds in them. You might arrive at a match and discover that you've only got, a limited number of mags, so determine the capacity and make sure you've got the same number of rounds in each mag. Okay, now I'm going to discuss low cover. IDPA defines low cover as when the shooter has one knee on the ground. You could have a low cover position that did not have a shoot over kind of a situation like this. It could still be a vertical wall, but if low cover was specified, at least one knee has to be down. You can choose your poison kind of on how you want to kneel. I think having the strong side knee down is best to help absolutely ensure you don't break cover, because if this knee is down, there's no way it can get out here. If you put your weak side knee down, there's always the possibility of this. And I find more often than not, again, if you're in a kneeling low cover position and the safety officer is yelling cover, cover, the problem is your knee or your foot is hanging out. So what I like to do when I approach a low cover position is kind of pick this imaginary line from the edge of the cover, extended straight up range, and put my strong side knee down on that line or just inside that line, so that no matter where I go with the gun or lean my body, that leg and foot is not going to be hanging out. So just remember, if low cover is specified, and it must be specified in the course of fire, at least one knee must be down, and I suggest you put the knee down on the strong side to help ensure that it doesn't extend beyond the edge of this cover.
So I'm going to talk here briefly about drawing to prone. A lot of times in IPSC shooting, you're going to have a stage requirement where you're going to draw to a prone position. So there's two different techniques for really drawing to prone, and there's one that typically most people use, and there's another one that Matt Burkett has kind of has adopted or instructed. The first draw to prone, typically what people will do is they will step forward and come down and bump. And what I mean by bump is, you'll note there is that I step into the position, my knee comes down, and the gun will literally bounce as as my knee hits the ground. So you can obviously tell that that's not an optimum way of doing things when going to kneeling. The other technique, which works better, which Matt Burkett teaches, is that you put basically most of your weight on your left leg and you come down, and you can control the drop a lot better that way. So instead of stepping forward, you're literally just lifting and coming down onto this knee. So it looks like that. And you really can control the drop with the muscles in your legs, so you can make a nice smooth touch on the ground as you're going to kneeling. Now, a lot of times also during a course of fire, you'll be running into a shooting position and going into a kneeling position. The problem with going into a kneeling position or coming out of a kneeling position is it takes time to do that. You typically, if you're going to have a position like that, you want to make it to the last position that you're shooting. So if you can arrange your attack of the course such that you can determine where the kneeling is going to occur, you want to make that the last thing that you do. Another position or kneeling is that where you're kneeling with both knees down. So that's going to look something like this. The problem is that when you do that, getting out of this position is very difficult. I mean, it takes time to come up unless you're really quick at coming up like this. But again, if you're shooting in a very low position where it requires that you're down on both knees, you really want to make sure that's probably the last place that you go into, because not only does it take time to get into it, it takes even more time to get out of it. Okay, so now we're going to talk prone shooting. Prone shooting does not happen very often in IPSC, thank God. Most people in IPSC absolutely hate going prone. Now, clearly I have a nice big mat here set out for going prone, but typically during an IPSC course of fire, they aren't going to be so nice. They may put a small piece of carpet down for you, and you do get dirty and everything. The thing with going prone is it's pretty much a complete commitment from your standpoint of going to prone. The contact with the ground usually is fairly hard. There's no way to really stop yourself and gradually go prone. I'll take that back. Actually, there is one way where you can go down to both knees and then go slide forward, so I can demonstrate for you. But pretty much it's an all or nothing commit. The key thing on going prone, obviously, is to draw your gun first before you go down. You don't want to go down, go prone, and then pull your gun, because when you do that, you're pointing the gun behind you at everybody behind you, and that will be a 180 DQ situation. So I also have another problem with going prone is because of what I discussed before, rotator cuff damage to my right arm. I cannot go prone and extend both arms out into a traditional prone position that you see a lot of people go into. I have to do a quartering position where I will literally put basically quarter onto my right-hand side. I end up putting my cheek on my bicep and resting it there, and then pretty much having a somewhat straight arm on my right side. and then my body's angled back. So it basically looks like this. Again, it's all or nothing, so here we go. Okay, so you can see here what I'm doing is that I have the gun rested on the magazine for support. Now, some people will argue that you don't want to do this because doing that can push the magazine up into the base of the gun and possibly induce failures. I've never had that happen, but it is something to be aware of. You might want to check it out. So in the prone position here, you can see that I'm quartered off. My line of sight is straight down this arm. My cheek basically rests on the bicep, and I'm perfectly lined up with the target. It's a very safe shooting position in doing this. If I'm trying to straighten my body out, which I unfortunately cannot do, it's the same thing. The one thing you want to avoid, though, is if you are straightened out, is that you don't have your arms up like this and the gun floating off the ground, because it ends up basically the gun will just sit here and bounce as you shoot. So you really want to plant it against the ground as you're shooting. The other technique for going prone, which I mentioned is basically not quite as abusive, is that you'll go down onto both knees like this. Actually, you want to draw first. So we're going to draw, go down onto both knees, this hand out, come down, and come into the same position. So you can do either method, but again, I kind of use the the throw yourself down on the ground method. What I do is I find where I want to plant this hand, shoot my legs straight back, and basically just let gravity do its thing. So I'll pick a spot. I hate this. Pick a spot, draw, and right into it. And if you do this over and over and over, you're going to rash in your elbow after doing it quite a few times. So prone is not something you practice a lot for a lot of good reasons. One of the other things is that typically in prone is that, it's usually in IPSC it's done as parts of strings of what's called a standard exercise, which we'll talk about later. But a string, you basically have, the first string might be shooting freestyle targets, and the next string might be shooting strong hand or weak hand targets, and the last string will be the prone part of the target. So again, from a prone position here, pick your spot, put your hand down, go into it, and you shoot, blam, 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 blam. Okay, when you're done, the first command the range officer is going to give you is if you're done, unload and show clear. Don't do it on the ground. Don't drop your mag like this and do all this and make them bend over and do that. For some people, they may have a problem on getting up out of a prone position just because of age or joints or whatever. It's okay to ground your gun, but if you do it, you need to make sure that the safety is on. Rule requirement in IPSC is that if you ground your gun, safety has to be on. It has to be what's defined as the ready condition for the division you're in. So ground your gun, flip the safety on, put it down, stand up, however you need to stand up, whatever it takes to do that. And then pick your gun up and go through the unload and show clear process of basically showing the RO that you have a clear chamber. If you're able to basically get up, if you don't have any problems with having to ground the gun from the prone position. So again, we'll pick our spot. Okay, do my shooting, blam, 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 blam. I'm done. Basically, at this point, I'm going to flip my safety on just from a safety standpoint. Fingers are down the side of the gun. I'll get up, pointing the gun down range at all times. Stand, flip the safety off, pull the mag, and go through the unload and show clear process. Okay, so that's it for IDPA cover and drawing to kneeling and prone.